Some people don't show you who they truly are until the moment you need them most. That's when the mask finally slips, and what's underneath is something you can never unsee. My name is Dorothy Callahan. I'm 67 years old, and I spent most of those years believing that love, real love, was something you earned by giving everything you had. I gave until my hands ached, and my savings dwindled, and my voice went hoarse from saying yes when every bone in my body wanted to say no. I gave because I was a mother, and that was what mothers did. Or so I thought, until the morning I woke up alone in a hospital room in Columbus, Ohio, with a titanium rod in my hip and not a single familiar face in sight. Before I take you back to that morning, I want to ask you something. Where are you listening from today? Because these words have a way of finding the people who need them most, and I think maybe you're one of them. Maybe you already know this kind of silence. The kind that wraps around you in a room full of machines and sterile walls when the person you raised from infancy doesn't bother to pick up the phone. Let me tell you how it started. I had been putting off the hip replacement for 2 years. My orthopedic surgeon had recommended it the summer before, but I kept delaying because my son, Kevin, and his wife, Renee, had just moved into my house. Temporarily, they said. Just until they got back on their feet after Renee's business venture fell apart. I didn't want the disruption of surgery and recovery while they were settling in. I wanted to be useful. I wanted to be needed. Looking back now, I understand that those two things are not the same as being loved. By January, the pain had become impossible to ignore. Some mornings I could barely swing my legs over the side of the bed. My neighbor, Pauline, the retired schoolteacher who lived 2 doors down, was the one who finally insisted I call the doctor. She drove me to the consultation herself, sat in the waiting room with a crossword puzzle, and drove me home again. My son was at work. Renee was at a yoga class. Neither of them asked how the appointment went. The surgery was scheduled for the 14th of March. A Tuesday, Kevin said he would be there. He said it with the confidence of someone making a casual promise. The kind you make without really meaning it, the kind that evaporates the moment something more appealing comes along. Something more appealing came along. I didn't know it right away. When I went under anesthesia that morning, I still believed my son would be sitting in the surgical waiting room with a bad cup of hospital coffee and his phone buzzing with emails he'd pretend not to check. I believed it because I had spent 38 years teaching him that family shows up. I taught him by example, driving 4 hours through a snowstorm when his college roommate's funeral fell on a weekend I had already planned a trip of my own. I taught him by sitting beside his father's hospital bed for 11 consecutive nights, sleeping in a recliner chair, eating vending machine sandwiches, never once complaining. I taught him. Or so I thought. When I came out of the anesthesia, the first thing I saw was a nurse with a clipboard. The second thing I noticed was the empty chair. I asked her if anyone had called. She had the kind of gentle eyes that people develop when they've delivered too much bad news. She checked the whiteboard on the wall, then looked back at me. "No calls logged for this room," she said. "Is there someone I can try to reach for you?" I gave her Kevin's number. She stepped into the hallway. When she came back, she told me it had gone to voicemail. I told myself there was an explanation. Traffic. A dead battery. Some minor emergency with the dog. I spent the first day of recovery building excuses for my son, the way I'd once built blanket forts for him when he was small, carefully, with great effort, to keep him protected from something uncomfortable. By the 3rd day, the excuses had run out. It was a young physical therapist named Marcus who let it slip, not cruelly, just carelessly, the way people speak when they don't know the full weight of what they're saying. He was helping me take my first steps down the hallway, holding the gate belt around my waist, when he mentioned he'd overheard a conversation at the nurses' station about a family that had gone on a Caribbean cruise while their mother was in post-surgical recovery. He said it the way you'd mention something you saw on the news. Distant, not personal. But then he glanced at my room number on the door, and his face changed. He didn't say anything else. He didn't have to. That afternoon, I asked the floor nurse directly. She hesitated long enough to confirm what I already suspected. My emergency contact had been reached the morning of surgery. Kevin had acknowledged the call. He had said he understood the procedure had gone smoothly, and then, as best as anyone on that floor could piece together, he had boarded a cruise ship with his wife for a 10-day voyage to the Bahamas. I lay in that hospital bed and listened to my own heartbeat on the monitor beside me. 67 years old, a retired labor and delivery nurse who had held the hands of strangers through the worst moments of their lives. I had coached frightened young mothers through 12-hour labors. I had sat with families in waiting rooms after emergencies. I had always shown up, for everyone, for decades. And my own son couldn't delay a vacation by a single week so that his mother wouldn't wake up from surgery alone. I didn't cry right away. I think I was too stunned for tears. What I felt instead was a slow, spreading coldness, the kind that starts in the chest and works its way outward until your hands feel numb and everything seems very far away. It was the feeling of something ending, not dramatically, just quietly, like a door swinging shut in a room you didn't know you'd been standing in. The hospital social worker visited me on the 4th day, a kind woman named Sandra who wore reading glasses on a beaded chain. She helped me arrange for a home health aide to assist with recovery since, as she gently noted, my household contacts appeared to be unavailable. I thanked her. I signed the forms. And while she was still sitting across from me with her folder open on her knee, something shifted behind my eyes. I made a decision. I would not call Kevin. I would not leave a voicemail. I would not send a text that would go read and unanswered for days. I was going to go home, and I was going to be very, very quiet, and I was going to pay attention. My neighbor Pauline picked me up from the hospital on discharge day. She had borrowed a wheelchair from the church auxiliary and loaded the back of her Buick with a casserole dish, a throw blanket she'd knitted herself, and a bag of groceries. She fussed over me the entire ride home, asking if the seat was comfortable, whether the heat was too high, whether I wanted the radio on. I answered in short sentences, watching the familiar streets of my neighborhood slide past the window. When we pulled into my driveway, I noticed Kevin's car was gone. Renee's, too. The house had that particular stillness of a place that hasn't been occupied in days. The trash bins were still at the curb from last Wednesday's pickup. The front porch light I always left on at night was burned out and hadn't been replaced. Pauline helped me inside and settled me into the recliner in the living room. She offered to stay, but I told her I needed rest. After she left, I sat in the quiet and looked around the house my late husband, Gerald, and I had bought 31 years ago. Kevin and Renee's presence was everywhere. Renee's coat hung on the hook by the door. Kevin's running shoes were kicked under the coffee table. Their dishes from what looked like days ago were stacked in the sink. They had left in a rush. They had not thought to empty the trash, lock the windows, or wonder for one moment who would be watering the houseplants while their mother recovered from major surgery. I reached for my phone. Not to call Kevin, I called my bank. This is the part that still makes me catch my breath when I think about it, because what I found on that call was worse than anything I had imagined lying in the hospital. My checking account, the one attached to the debit card I had given Kevin access to for what I'd been told were temporary household expenses, showed 14 transactions over the past 11 days. A cruise booking, port fees, shore excursion packages, a spa reservation, a duty-free purchase, a restaurant in Nassau, over $4,000, gone. I stayed very still on the phone while the customer service representative read me the transaction list. I asked her to email me a full statement. I thanked her. I hung up. Then I sat there in the recliner with my surgical leg propped on a pillow, and I thought carefully about what to do next. Here is the thing that people who hear this story sometimes don't understand. They ask why I didn't freeze the account that day, why I didn't call the bank and report the card misused that very afternoon, and I understand the question. Believe me, the thought crossed my mind. But I had spent 35 years as a nurse, and one thing that career teaches you is that you do not make critical decisions in the immediate aftermath of shock. You wait, you assess, you gather information before you act, because a hasty move can complicate things, and I had learned from colleagues who'd rushed into confrontations without documentation that it almost always made things harder, not easier. I also knew something else. I needed everything in writing before I made a single move. I needed the evidence to be irrefutable, not just to myself, but to a lawyer. So I waited 2 days. I let the account activity continue while I documented every transaction with timestamps and screenshots. I noted the dates. I cross-referenced them with my surgical records, which Sandra from social work had been kind enough to send me in a follow-up email. The pattern was precise and damning. Kevin had accessed my account the morning of my surgery and had kept spending freely for 10 days while I recovered alone. On the 3rd day home, I called an attorney named Patricia, someone my late husband had trusted years ago. I explained the situation. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she said, "Dorothy, before you confront anyone or lock anyone out of anything, let me help you do this right." We spent 2 days doing it right. I opened a new bank account at a different institution and transferred my remaining savings, my pension deposits, and Gerald's life insurance settlement, which I had never touched, into accounts that existed entirely outside Kevin's knowledge. Patricia drafted the documentation I would need if this ever became a legal matter. She also quietly began the paperwork to update my will, which had previously left everything to Kevin. We changed that. The house, the savings, the small investment portfolio Gerald had carefully built over decades, all of it redirected. Some to a scholarship fund for nursing students at the community college I had attended 40 years ago. Some to Pauline's church, which ran a food pantry for elderly residents in the neighborhood. Kevin received nothing. It was Patricia who suggested I say nothing to Kevin until everything was finalized. She said it calmly and professionally, the way she said everything. People panic when they realize they're losing access to money, she told me. Don't give them the opportunity to complicate your exit. So I didn't. I recovered in my recliner. I let the home health aide come and go. I answered the one text Kevin sent midway through the cruise, something breezy about hoping I was feeling okay, with a simple, "I'm fine, enjoy your trip." I gave nothing away. I let him believe everything was exactly as he expected it to be. While he sipped drinks on a deck chair somewhere in the Atlantic, I called a locksmith. The locksmith was a quiet man named Earl who replaced every lock in the house in under 2 hours. He handed me a set of new keys in a small paper envelope. I held them in my palm for a moment before slipping them into my cardigan pocket. I thanked him, paid in cash, and watched his truck back out of the driveway. Then I called the phone company and got a new number. This is the other thing people ask about. Why change the number? Because I knew what was coming. I knew the calls and the texts and the voicemails, each one escalating, each one cycling through anger and guilt and appeals to obligation. I had received those calls before over smaller disagreements. I knew how they went, and I decided that this time the silence would be mine to control, not something imposed on me by people who only called when they wanted something. I spent the following week going through the house with careful, deliberate hands. My china, the set my mother had given me at my wedding, I wrapped in newspaper and boxed for donation to a church sale. I knew Renee had always admired it for the wrong reasons, commenting on its resale value rather than its history. Gerald's workshop tools I left to Pauline's son, who had always borrowed them anyway and always returned them clean. My own things, the quilts, the books, the framed photographs of Gerald and me on our 30th anniversary trip to Savannah, I packed into boxes and loaded into Pauline's minivan over 3 quiet afternoons. I called a realtor named Diane, who wore sensible shoes and spoke without wasting words. She walked through the house and told me what it would bring on the current market. The number surprised me. I told her to list it. Before I left, I did one last thing. I went to the writing desk in the living room, the one Kevin had told me more than once he planned to take when I was gone, as though he were simply waiting out the clock on my existence. And I sat down and wrote 2 letters. One was for Kevin, one was for Renee. I sealed them in separate envelopes and left them on the kitchen counter, weighted down by the set of old house keys they would no longer be able to use. Kevin's letter said this: "I raised you to understand that love is shown in presence, not in promises. I lay in that hospital for 11 days. You spent them in the Bahamas, charged to my account without a single phone call to ask if I had survived the surgery. I want you to know that I am alive. I want you to know that I saw every transaction, and I want you to know that I am choosing, clearly and without confusion, to walk away from the version of family we have become. The house will be sold, the accounts are closed to you, my attorney has the paperwork. Do not come looking for an argument. There is nothing left here to argue over. Renee's letter was shorter. It said only, "You were never unkind to my face." That made it harder to see what was happening. I hope you find a way to treat the next person in your life with the honesty you could never quite offer me. I placed the new key envelope on top of Kevin's letter, the keys that opened nothing, in a house that no longer belonged to him. Then I loaded the last box into Pauline's van, locked the front door with the only key that mattered, and drove away. I had found a small, furnished apartment in a town called Granville, about 40 minutes east of Columbus. A quiet place, narrow streets lined with old maples, a coffee shop on the corner where the owner remembered your order by your third visit. I had spent a weekend there with Gerald the year before he got sick, and I had never forgotten how the light looked on that main street in the late afternoon, golden and unhurried. It had seemed like a place where time moved at the right pace. I wanted that now. My new apartment had 2 windows that faced a small garden. There was a reading chair by one of them, already positioned at an angle that caught the morning light. It felt, from the first moment I walked in, like a place where I could breathe. The call came 9 days later. I had a new number, so it wasn't a call. It was a knock. Kevin had gotten my address from Diane, the realtor, who had made the mistake of assuming he was aware of the situation and answered his question politely. I would speak to Diane about that later. But for now, there was my son standing in the doorway of my new apartment on a Thursday afternoon, red-faced and breathing hard like he had run the last block, though I suspected it was rage rather than exertion that had him flushed. He did not wait to be invited in. He stepped past me into the small entryway and stood in the middle of my living room, looking around as though he were cataloging losses. "Where is everything?" he said. I closed the door quietly behind him. "Everything is exactly where I put it," I said. "Mom," he turned to face me, and I saw it then. Not grief, not remorse, but the particular expression of a man who has realized that something he assumed was permanent has been rearranged without his permission. The house is listed for sale. The bank account is empty. We came back and couldn't get in. What is going on? I walked past him to the reading chair and sat down. "Sit down, Kevin." "I don't want to sit down. I want to understand what you've done." "I know," I said, "but we're not going to have this conversation with you standing over me. Sit down." He sat. Old habits from childhood. Some instructions still land before the resentment catches up. I let the quiet hold for a moment. Outside the window, a sparrow landed on the garden fence and looked around with bright, indifferent eyes. "I woke up from surgery alone," I said finally. "Do you know what that's like? After 11 hours of anesthesia, coming back to consciousness in a strange room with tubes in your arm and a pain you were not prepared for, and looking at the chair beside the bed and finding no one there?" Kevin opened his mouth. "Don't," I said. "I'm not asking a question. I'm telling you something I need you to hear." He closed his mouth. I waited. I continued. "I told myself you were coming. I made up reasons. Traffic, a flight delay. Some emergency that made it impossible. I kept making excuses for you the way I have been making excuses for you for the past several years, because it was easier than acknowledging what was actually happening." I paused. "You took $4,000 from my account while I was in the hospital. You took it for a vacation, and you didn't tell me, and you didn't call. We thought you'd understand," he said. "The trip was already booked. You said the surgery would be straightforward." "I said the surgery would be straightforward," I repeated slowly. "Kevin, do you hear yourself?" He looked at the floor. "You are my child," I said. "I held you when you were 1 hour old and made a promise to you that I kept for 38 years. I showed up. For everything. Every school play you didn't want me to attend. Every job interview you were terrified of. Every hard thing that happened to you, I was there. And when the hardest thing that has happened to me in years occurred, you were not there. You were not there, and you used my money to pay for the reason you weren't there. We'll pay it back, he said. Yes, I agreed. You will. Patricia has the paperwork. But that's not why I'm here. I looked at him steadily. I'm here because I finally decided to take the same energy I have spent my entire adult life pouring into you and pour it into myself instead. The house is sold. The money is in accounts you cannot access. My will has been updated. You are not in it. The color drained from his face so quickly it was almost startling. Mom, you can't. I already did, I said. 2 weeks ago. Everything goes to a scholarship fund for nursing students and some to Pauline's church pantry. I thought about it carefully. I wanted the money to go somewhere it would help people who were still in the business of showing up for others. Kevin stood. Then he sat again. Then he pressed both hands flat on his knees as though bracing himself against something. Renee didn't know it would be this bad, he said finally, quietly. She thought you'd be fine. Maybe she was right, I said. I am fine. That's not the point. I looked at my hands in my lap. My mother's rings, the ones I had been wearing for 40 years, caught the afternoon light. The point is that I spent so long being your safety net that neither of us noticed I had become invisible. I wasn't your mother. I was a resource. A house to live in, an account to draw from, a fallback for when things went wrong. And I let it happen, Kevin. That's my failure as much as yours. I let it go on too long. He was quiet for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice had changed. Some of the bristle was gone from it. Where does this leave us? He asked. That's up to you, I said. I'm not telling you I never want to see you again. I'm telling you that the relationship we had is over, because that relationship was not honest. If you want something different, something where you treat me like a person instead of a utility, then that is something we could talk about. Not today, but eventually. He stood. He looked around the apartment one more time, as though searching for something he could take with him. There was nothing here that had ever been his. That was the point. I'll call you, he said. I have a new number, I told him. Patricia has it. When you're ready. He walked to the door. He paused with his hand on the frame, and for just a moment, I saw something cross his face that looked like the boy he used to be, young and uncertain and aware that he had done something that could not be easily undone. I felt the ache of it, the way you feel the ache of a healed fracture in cold weather. It's real, but it's not the same as fresh pain. He left. The door clicked shut. I sat in my reading chair and listened to the sparrow in the garden. That was 4 months ago. The house sold quickly. Diane was right about the market. The money settled into my new accounts like water finding its level, calm and without drama. I have a routine now. Coffee from the corner shop in the mornings, a walk down the main street when my hip allows it, a library card I've already used more in 4 months than I had in the previous 10 years. Pauline visits on weekends, and we sit in the garden with iced tea and talk about everything and nothing. Kevin has called, through Patricia, twice. I am not ready yet. That's an honest answer, not a performance of anger. I am simply not ready. There is a difference between forgiveness and restoration. And I've learned, late but not too late, that you don't have to do both at once. Sometimes at night, I lie in my new bed in this small apartment, in this quiet town, and I wait for the regret to arrive. People tell you that cutting family off is something you'll always second guess, that you'll lie awake wondering if you went too far. And maybe someday I will. But what I find in those quiet moments is not regret. What I find is a steadiness I don't have a better word for. The steadiness of a person who finally made a decision based on what was true rather than on what was expected. I spent decades being the soft place where everyone else landed. I was the emergency contact, the spare key holder, the one who made the casserole and drove the 4 hours and sat in the hard chairs of waiting rooms. I was all of those things, and I gave them freely, because I believed that was the shape love took. What I know now is that love has to move in both directions, or it's not love, it's just labor. I am 67 years old, and I woke up from surgery alone in a hospital room, and somehow that turned out to be the beginning of the most honest chapter of my life. If you're watching this and something about it sounds familiar, I want you to hear me say it plainly. You do not have to wait for a crisis to decide that your life belongs to you. You do not have to wait until the chair beside your hospital bed is empty to understand what you actually mean to the people around you. You are allowed to ask for what you deserve. You are allowed to walk away when the answer is silence. You are allowed to choose your own peace before it's the last thing left to choose. I am choosing mine every single morning now. In this small apartment, in this quiet town, in the light that falls through my reading chair window and lands warm on the floor. I am choosing it in the coffee from the corner shop and the library card and the sparrow in the garden who doesn't know my name and doesn't need to. This is mine. And it is enough. And if you're sitting somewhere right now wondering if you deserve the same thing, I am here to tell you, you do. You always did. You just have to be the first one to believe it.